My mother chose her new husband over me. Here's how I got revenge. I grew up with a strong bond with my mother. It was just the two of us after my father passed away when I was young. I don't remember much of him, but my mom filled every role in my life: mother, father, best friend. She was loving, supportive, and incredibly hardworking. I felt safe with her. She worked long hours at a marketing firm, but somehow always found time to listen to me, to take me places, to make me feel like the most important person in the world. We didn't have much, but we had each other, and that was enough. The turning point came when I was 18. I had just graduated high school, and my mom seemed unusually distracted. It started subtly. Her late nights at work became longer, she spent more time on her phone, and our conversations became more surface level. Then one day, she introduced me to Mark, her new boyfriend. He was charming, at least at first, with a booming laugh and a constant air of authority about him. He worked in finance and seemed to have everything together. At first, I didn't mind him. I was an adult now, and I understood that she had needs beyond being my mom. But as time passed, I started noticing things. Mark was always around, showing up unexpectedly at our house, hanging out at the dinner table like he was part of the family. I didn't mind the company, but something felt off. He had an air of entitlement, and it didn't take long for me to notice the way he subtly undermined my place in our home. The red flags started small. He would make little jabs about how I should be more responsible or grow up. These comments would usually be framed as jokes, but it was clear he didn't think much of me. My mom, instead of calling him out, would laugh along, reinforcing his comments with a shrug or a nod. Over time, it became clear that he wasn't just an annoying presence. He was someone who would eventually take over our family dynamic. What hurt the most, though, was how my mom slowly started prioritizing him over me. The most glaring example was when she moved in with him. She hadn't even discussed it with me beforehand. She just told me one day, "I'm moving in with Mark." She seemed so excited, like it was the next natural step. I was crushed, but she reassured me that I could still come visit, but I could tell something was different. The visits became less frequent, and when I did go to their place, I could feel the tension. It was like I was an outsider in my own home, and Mark was calling all the shots. I tried to talk to her about it once, about how I felt like I was being pushed aside. She dismissed it quickly, saying I was being dramatic. I didn't want to be that kid who resented her mom's relationship, but it was becoming harder to ignore. Every time I tried to get closer to her, I felt like I was met with a wall of indifference, as though she was more interested in her new life with Mark than in the one we'd built together. Things took a darker turn one summer when I was 19. My mother had promised to come to my graduation ceremony, a huge milestone for me, and I had been counting on her support. But the night before, she called me with some bad news. Mark had planned a weekend getaway, and she felt it was more important to go with him than to be there for me. I was devastated. I remember sitting there, holding my phone, as she gave me this flimsy excuse about how she couldn't let Mark down. It felt like a slap in the face. I was trying to hold back tears, but the betrayal was so raw. I knew she had always prioritized her relationships, but this felt different. This felt like a betrayal of our entire bond. When I confronted her, I thought maybe she didn't realize how much this hurt me. But when I explained how this made me feel like I didn't matter to her anymore, she didn't even try to comfort me. Instead, Mark got on the phone and practically lectured me about how I should be more independent and not rely on her so much. The audacity. That was when I realized something had changed irreparably. My mother was choosing him over me. The emotional fallout was almost immediate. I withdrew from my mom emotionally and physically. I stayed in my room, cutting off communication, trying to make sense of what was happening. The resentment I felt toward her started to eat at me. She was supposed to be my support system, and now she had chosen him. I couldn't understand it. How could a mother prioritize her partner over her own child? I had no one to talk to about it, and I felt completely alone. I tried to find solace in friends, but none of them understood. They didn't know what it felt like to have your own mother turn her back on you. I started to spiral. My confidence plummeted, and I became resentful of Mark. But it wasn't just him. It was the way my mom had allowed it to happen. As the months went on, things only got worse. Mark had become more controlling, and my mom, instead of standing up to him, was increasingly complicit. She'd ignore my phone calls or texts, always giving me the excuse that she was too busy or Mark needs me. I tried to get her attention, tried to tell her how much this was hurting me, but it was like talking to a brick wall. Mark would be right there, always guiding the conversation, always telling her what to do, and she followed his lead. It got to the point where I was forced to move out. I had tried to bring up the fact that I still needed her, that I wasn't ready to be on my own, but my mother sided with Mark. "You're an adult now, you should learn to fend for yourself," she said. My heart broke all over again, but I didn't fight it anymore. I packed my things and moved into a small apartment. It was the final straw. I knew I had to stop seeking validation from someone who had clearly chosen a man over her own flesh and blood. It hurt, but I realized that if I wanted to reclaim my life, I needed to stop depending on her. But that didn't mean I'd let them get away with it. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. I didn't just want to move on. I wanted revenge. I wanted to expose them both for what they had done. That was when I started digging. I found out that Mark wasn't exactly the upstanding guy he portrayed himself to be. There were rumors about him, whispers of shady business dealings, and a history of financial problems. My mom had always been so blinded by her love for him that she hadn't seen it, but I was determined to make her see the truth. 4. The revenge plan. I spent the next few months carefully planning. I wasn't just going to let this go. I wanted my mother to understand how wrong she was to choose him over me. I wasn't doing this to cause chaos for the sake of it, but I needed her to wake up and realize the toxic situation she was living in. I started digging deeper into Mark's financial dealings. With the help of some old contacts, I was able to uncover evidence that Mark had been involved in some shady financial practices. It wasn't a huge crime, but it was enough to ruin his reputation and expose him for the manipulative person he was. Mark had been involved in fraudulent activities that hurt several people, and the fact that he had kept all of this hidden from my mother only made me more furious. It wasn't just that he was controlling her, he was using her for his own gain. But I didn't want to just expose Mark. I wanted my mother to understand the extent of her mistake. I knew she wouldn't listen to me directly. I needed a more impactful way to show her the reality of her situation. I needed to hit them where it hurt the most: public humiliation. I decided the best course of action was to use the information I had on Mark, combined with the way my mother had betrayed me, to create an unforgettable moment. I started working on a plan to expose everything at a family event. It was risky, but I knew it would be the best way to finally get my point across. My mother and Mark were both big on family gatherings, and there was a major holiday coming up, Thanksgiving, where everyone would be together. I knew it was the perfect moment to execute my plan. I began to lay the groundwork. I reached out to a few of my mom's closest friends and family members, subtly feeding them information about Mark. I made sure they knew that he wasn't the great guy he seemed to be, and how he had manipulated my mom into pushing me away. Slowly, the whispers spread. By the time Thanksgiving arrived, I had built enough momentum. My mother and Mark would not be able to ignore the storm that was brewing. The night before the big event, I stayed up late preparing. I made sure everything was set: the financial documents I had uncovered, emails and messages that proved Mark's shady dealings, and a carefully worded post on social media that would send everything into chaos. The plan was simple. I would post it all during Thanksgiving dinner. The timing would ensure maximum impact, and it would guarantee that my mother would be unable to defend him when the truth came out. 5. The execution of revenge. Thanksgiving dinner was exactly as I expected. A lavish spread of food, my mom and Mark greeting guests like everything was perfectly fine. I could see the tension on my mom's face as she realized some of the guests had already started whispering about Mark. He tried to charm everyone, but it was obvious he was a little on edge. I knew he must have heard the rumors, but I wasn't worried. This wasn't about him. It was about showing my mother what she had done. I waited until the dinner was almost over, right when the mood was at its peak. The conversations were lively, everyone was laughing, and the wine was flowing. I took a deep breath, pulled out my phone, and posted everything I had been gathering for months. I included a detailed post about Mark's financial schemes, complete with screenshots, links to news stories, and emails that proved he had been deceiving my mother. I also included the painful truth about how he had systematically pushed me out of our family, how he had manipulated her into abandoning me. I wrote everything as clearly and concisely as possible, without pulling any punches. The moment I hit post, the room fell silent. The shock was immediate. My mom stared at me, her eyes wide with disbelief as the realization hit her. Mark's face turned pale, and I could see his mouth moving, but nothing was coming out. The guests who had been in the know about Mark's past began murmuring, and others were looking at him like he was a criminal. I stood up, holding my head high. I had prepared for this moment, but the feeling of watching everything unravel in front of me was both terrifying and exhilarating. I could hear my mother's voice crack as she asked, "Why would you do this?" "Because you chose him over me," I said, my voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions I was feeling. "You let him control you, manipulate you, and push me out of your life. You can't even see what he's doing to you." Mark tried to speak, but the damage was done. People were already on their phones, searching the links I had posted. The whispers grew louder. Someone called the police, and within minutes, Mark was being escorted outside for questioning about his financial practices. My mom's face was red, a mix of anger, embarrassment, and regret. It was hard to look at her, but I knew this was the only way to get through to her. As the evening continued, I left the house. I didn't want to be there for the fallout. I knew this was going to be the hardest thing my mom had ever experienced, but it wasn't my responsibility to protect her from the consequences of her own actions. I had to do this for myself,